it's just a fantastic thing that something that began really with a small band of radicals in 1943, roughly, has expanded to become a nationwide event. Because we're not here just to celebrate my father's centenary, which of course is an important enough reason all by itself, but in many ways, what we're also celebrating automatically by being here in such large numbers with a sold-out crowd, not only here, but in Montreal. Niagara-on-the-Lake had a sold-out crowd. There have been events going on from Goose Bay in Labrador to Corner Brook in Newfoundland, right across the country to Whitehorse in the Yukon, to Bowen Island and Galliano Island in the Gulf Islands off the coast of BC, all the way to Victoria. These events are happening because what began with First Statement and Northern Review with poets like A.M. Klein and Louis Dudek and Raymond Souster, my uncle John Sutherland, my mother Betty Sutherland, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a few other poets that I really should name, but I just wanted to name a few. This band of poets created a sensibility which has in fact spread right across the country to the point where we have this amazing event, which is a nationwide event, and frankly we even had some events in Jerusalem, in Rome, in Paris, and in Cambridge, all celebrating my dad's 100th birthday. So it's an amazing thing. And this evening is the culmination of these events. We really do have an amazing evening ahead of us. Some very special guests. First of all, we have luminaries like Margaret Atwood, Dennis Lee, Barry Callahan, Fred Waugh, who is the newly appointed Poet Laureate of Canada. We have dear old friends like Rosemary Sullivan, Anna Porter, former students. Actually, Rosemary was a former student as well, briefly, I believe, at Concordia. Former students like Moses Znaimer and Joe Kertes, who's the Dean of Creative Writing at Humber. We have my good friend, who also was a friend of my father's, Robert Priest. We have another very good friend who is also my publisher, Guernica Editions, and that's Mike Mirolla. He's an author himself also. We have Canada's greatest benefactor to poetry, Mr. Scott Griffin. And, let's see, I'm desperately trying not to forget anybody. We have younger poets representing the fact that, my father's influence is still very much alive. Priscila Uppal, Jacob Mooney, and Julie Roorda. And then at the end of the evening, something very special. My father's dear, dear friend, Leonard Cohen, has made a video specially for us this evening. At the end of the evening, folks, we're going to see the world premiere of a Leonard Cohen video. So I think we're all looking forward to that. That's kind of like the cherry on top of the icing, on top of the cake.
Untruth, truth. From hypocrisy I weave directness. Almost now I know who I am. Almost I have the boldness to be that man. Another step, and I shall be where I started from.
In 1967, 68, somewhere in there, I was made the books editor of the Toronto Telegram, which was a very peculiar operation. It was a cross between the New York Herald Tribune and the present-day Toronto Sun. Schizophrenic, to say the least, and somewhere there I was in the middle of it. And on the book pages, I had started printing not only reviews, but also fiction. I remember we printed Marie Claire Blais, and the executive editor hauled me into his office, screaming at the top of his voice, "What is that?" And also poetry. Now, how I quite came to meet Irving at that time, I don't know, but he informed me that he was going to Israel and he would love to send me poems and prose. And I said, great. About 5 weeks later, I got a packet, and it contained 2 prose pieces. One, Irving having coffee on Dizengoff, which is the main drag in Tel Aviv, and another piece set in the graveyard. I read them and I thought, boy, these 2 pieces are really one. And it was a Thursday night, and the paper we went into print on Friday. So, without giving it much thought, I just made the 2 pieces one. A little quick edit here, a little quick edit there, and it was printed on Saturday morning. And then I sent them to the page to Irving with a check. And 2 weeks later, got a typical Irving letter. You idiot. You half-baked academic. You poser in prose. You hapless goy. You jerk. You muffled product of your mother's womb. You goy. But of course you are right. And I'm going to print the piece as such in my next book. This led to our relationship, and it led to where I'm going to begin. Because Irving came home from Israel. He lived in Montreal then, and he invited me to supper. I was sitting with Irving Layton in his apartment in Montreal. We were talking about fathers, about how his father had a black beard, and how his eyes were black, and how he had been harried by angels who had nibbled at his ears. They talked to him, Irving said. All the prophets talked to him, but he didn't talk much to me. But my mother, she did. My mother held me up by the heels, and there I was, the first Jew since Moses to be born circumcised. To her, I was the Messiah. I could do no wrong. She gave me freedom. Of course, she was backward, ignorant, but a woman of power and feeling. Now I understand, I said. What, he said. All that mad Montreal saint of the mountain stuff, all your arrogance and strutting, it's as simple as that. Your mother told you you were the Messiah. Of course, it had not been as simple as that, and yet on that evening, I saw how he had carried the peculiar vituperative fever of the prophet with him all his life. He'd always been on stage, the poet decrying other poets, calling them liars and trained seals. He'd always been the avenging angel, a little ridiculous, wrong-headed, striding out of his Judean hills, always in the stance of the lover, trusting no one, boxing half-baked intellectuals and poor-mouthed professors of a Presbyterian bent about the ears. And yet, there he was on that evening in Montreal, with his boy child standing beside him, holding the boy's little hands, then brushing back his hair, trying to urge a word out of him, saying, I'm worried. He should be talking. I talk to him all the time, and he says nothing. We sat and stared at the boy, who was about 3 years old, and the boy stood and smiled at us, and then he left the room. Since we're talking about prophets, I said, I'll tell you who my favorite saint is. It's Simon Stylites, an old Syrian in the days when the church was in the desert, and he built himself a 60-foot stone pillar, and he shinnied up the pillar and mounted it and lived and preached from that pillar for 30 years. He was a prophet to some, even a saint, but for me, he was the world's first flagpole sitter, sitting on top of the image of his own ego. The image of his sex, Irving said. By the way, I said, what does a man do with his shit for 30 years up on top of a pillar? He sits in it, Irving said. Any poet that's any good has had to have sat in his own shit. The little boy had wandered back into the room, and Irving took him in his arms and spoke softly to his silent face, almost singing to him. Irving, who'd always been so voluble and effusive, from the very beginning when he'd been a boy himself, living with his family in a tenement room under a semi-brothel. Each night he'd been wakened by the screams and shouts of roistering drunks, wakened by brawling and the crash of breaking beer bottles. His mother, kind Lazarevich, had begged her small son to get the broomstick, and he'd stumbled through the dark and thumped its handle into the ceiling. The pole had always made a dull wooden sound in the darkness, but it was then that the miracle had taken place. The loud cursings and clatterings would stop suddenly, he said, and silence, like some mysterious night flower, would blossom from the tip of my broomstick. It was uncanny, and in my child's imagination, I saw myself as a boy Moses parting the filthy, noise-filled blackness so that the long-suffering Israelites might pass safely into a region of peace and slumber. Each time the mysterious flower of silence opened its invisible blossoms over my head, I felt the same thrill of power, of exulting joy. I alone had punched a rectangular space of quiet into the filthy, drunken chaos and presented it to those older and stronger than myself. Layton, in full stride in long pants, his arm thrust into the night, is still crying, I alone, I curse all the passionless worms that slide their fearful gray forms over this astonishing earth. Let them dissolve like rain into the sought-for mud. Let their worm eyes explode from a sudden, unlooked-for glimpse of God. Perhaps, with Irving as God's agent, there had been a moment of silence among the exultant, cruel horrors of his house and the sheeny men of the neighborhood and the English on the mountain who had seemed to have the mysterious power of huge mastiffs. A silence amidst all the noise and pain of the Jewish quarter, noise that had presented him with a huge possibility, the thrill of power, as if the opening up of silence could be like a milk-white kitten curled up on the bough of an apple tree, a gigantic blossom until its green eyes blink. Irving, broompole in both fists, has been our self-appointed celebrant of life. He has been the adelantado, the front runner of English poetry in our country. He has been good alcohol in our blood. He has gone among us, quote, naked with mystery, condemning the joy haters by telling them they dance best who dance with desire, who lifting feet of fire from fire weave before they lie down a red carpet for the sun.